Why do the Jews celebrate Passover? First of all, it was commanded by God in Exodus 12. They were told that it was to be a permanent ordinance and to celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. They celebrate Passover to remember the mighty acts that God performed to bring them out of slavery. They also celebrate Passover to continue to teach the next generation so that they might also know what God has done. Now, kids have a way of showing us what we don't know. They humble us. They make us look at things from a simpler perspective. When I teach my own children, I often gain a better understanding of what I'm teaching because it forces me to break things down to its foundation and carefully build it up again so they can understand how it fits together. So the Jews, as they teach the next generation, they also have the opportunity to learn and build their faith in the process too. During this week, we reviewed the events of the Exodus and took the time to recognize how much of a storyteller God is. In fact, He is the greatest storyteller. He is the author of life. Many themes He uses in history come back around and weave a silver thread through time. Let's begin with question number 1. What caused the Israelites to become slaves in Egypt? We could begin with Pharaoh and say slavery happened because of his fear of the numerous Hebrews. But why were the Hebrews there in the first place? That's because Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Why did they sell him into slavery? Because they were jealous. Why were they jealous? Maybe because Jacob was playing favorites with Joseph. But ultimately, we can look at Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14, and see that God tells Abraham about Hebrew slavery in Egypt hundreds of years before it happens. We see that God has a plan, and it includes hardship. I think there's something there we can all take away. Things are going to be hard, but God has a plan beyond me. The story is bigger than us and our present suffering. Number 2, who was the first documented slave in Egypt? Joseph was. To summarize the outcome of Joseph's time in slavery, Joseph is sold to Potiphar. He's obedient, but Potiphar's wife is a vengeful temptress, or as was put in the study, a floozy. Joseph ends up wrongfully accused and in prison. While in prison, God gives him the ability to interpret dreams. He eventually interprets Pharaoh's dream and is able to warn him about famine. This leads to Joseph being put second in command of all Egypt. Now, if you get a chance to watch the Patterns of Evidence video on Right Now Media, like we posted in the homework, there are some very interesting facts shared, one of which is a place in Egypt that exists to this day called Bar Yosef, which means the waterway of Joseph. Joseph basically made a reservoir to store water, which of course was an asset during times of drought and famine, and it exists to this day. Joseph's family joins him in Egypt just as God told Abraham. Number 4. Generations later, a new Pharaoh forgets this history. Threatened by the prosperous Israelites, he orders all of their baby sons to be killed. Now, the Bible never says the specific name of this Pharaoh. This is actually kind of interesting, because Moses wrote Exodus, right? He grew up knowing Egyptian culture and customs, and when the Egyptians would chronicle history, they would just outright erase the name of leaders who had done wrong. It was a way of shaming them. They weren't even worth remembering their name. So Moses does this, and like with the Pharaoh of the Exodus. We don't see the Israelites leaving out parts of their genealogy when their own leaders do something shameful or embarrassing. Each king of Israel has at least one shameful story to his name. Leaving out names was an Egyptian thing. Number 5. The turning point in this narrative of slavery and genocide comes with Moses. Moses' mother puts him in the basket in the Nile, where Pharaoh's daughter finds him and takes him in. Moses' sister tells her that she will find someone to nurse the baby, and she gets their own mother. So she's actually able to have some part in raising Moses. How much or what it looked like, we don't know. Someone in our group commented on how Moses was likely an outsider to both the Hebrews and the Egyptians. As an adult, Moses kills an Egyptian in a passionate rage when he sees how poorly the Hebrews are being treated. Moses flees for his life because Pharaoh wants to kill him. He ends up in the land of Midian as a shepherd, married, and living what we assume would be a somewhat less dramatic life. Moses was nearly 80 years old. God speaks to Moses through the burning bush, asking him to return to Egypt to rescue the Israelites from slavery. This is in Exodus 3. Number 6. What seems most remarkable to you about Moses' calling? Our group had many different answers for this one, which of course is to be expected. There is no wrong answer here. For me, it's that the Exodus says in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, "Then the Lord said to him, 'Who has made man's mouth? Who made him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak.'" These bodies are just vessels for our spirits. When God gives us a purpose, He will see it through, no matter what obstacles we think we have. The miracle God gives Moses to show Pharaoh his power was a snake from Aaron's staff. Why a snake? Of all the things he could do, why is it a snake that his staff turns into? In Egyptian culture, snakes were a symbol of sovereignty, royalty, deity, and divine authority. The Pharaoh's headdress had a snake on it. So while it might seem random, God knew the human-made cultural symbolism and uses it to speak to the Egyptians. The Lord is God, and He's more powerful than Egypt's magicians, Pharaoh, or even gods. Moses meets with his brother Aaron. They show the Israelites the miracles initially, the staff to a snake and giving and healing of leprosy. Perhaps this was to give the Israelites hope. Then they take it to Pharaoh, where they first just ask if he will let them worship God in the wilderness. Pharaoh says no. Everyone gets discouraged, including Moses. But God has them ask Pharaoh again. This time, Aaron throws down his staff, and it turns into a snake. The magicians somehow are able to recreate this, but Aaron's staff, snake staff, eats the magician's snakes. After all this, the Pharaoh still will not let the people go, and the plagues start soon after. Number 7. What purposes did the plagues serve? They gave hope to the Israelites that their God was indeed with them. The plagues dethroned the Egyptian gods by demonstrating how powerless they actually were. They also broke Pharaoh's authority, which he used to oppress the people of Israel. Ultimately, the plagues led to the Israelites' freedom. What were the 10 plagues? 1. Blood. 2. Frogs. 3. Gnats. Some translations may say lice. 4. Swarms. We will get into this more during week 5. There are different traditions of what these were swarms of, so let's just call them swarms. 5. Diseased livestock. 6. Boils. 7. Hail. 8. Locust. 9. Darkness. And 10. Death of the firstborn. All of these plagues are bookended with blood and death of the firstborn, which in a way shows some poetic justice. Pharaoh was literally having the Hebrew boys thrown into the river Nile as a means of population control. And with the first plague, God is showing the Egyptians what He sees. That river is a river of blood. They killed those babies there. I also think it's pretty neat that God has Moses return to this place where he was intended to be killed as a baby. And here, God shows His authority and the reclamation of His people. And with the 10th and final plague, He takes the Egyptians' firstborn sons from them, just as they took His from him. The story comes full circle. Death of the firstborn is where we see Passover begin. We will learn about all the elements on the Seder plate in a couple weeks, but I want you to notice here at the first Passover we have 3 elements. Maror, which is the bitter herbs. They represent the bitterness of slavery. Matzah, unleavened bread, which represents a life emptied of sin. And the Passover lamb, which was sacrificed, its blood put over their doorposts to pardon them from the death of the firstborn. The Israelites were in slavery in Egypt and would have faced the same wrath of God that the Egyptians faced with the death of their firstborn sons, were it not for the blood of the Lamb. They had to participate to receive this. Since God is the author of life, Let's look at the symbolism he uses in the New Testament that calls back to this. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul is addressing sin going on within the church. Starting in verse 2, he says, "You are so proud of yourselves, but you should be mourning in sorrow and shame." Like the maror, we need to recognize the bitterness of our sinful lives. Without doing this, we would be slaves to sin. He continues, "Your boasting about this is terrible. Don't you realize that this sin is like a little yeast that spreads through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast by removing this wicked person from among you. Then you will be like a fresh batch of dough made without yeast, which is what you really are." Here we see leaven as a symbol for sin. Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed for us. So let us celebrate the festival, not with the old bread of wickedness and evil, but with a new bread of sincerity and truth. The blood of our Passover lamb saves us from sin so that we can live new lives in him. So why might we as Christians celebrate Passover? Paul was talking to Gentiles here. He wouldn't use Passover as an illustration for people who have no cultural concept of the festival. So the early church was celebrating Passover, and Passover is an analogy for the exodus from sin through Christ.